Oh my god, that's on time. Well, welcome back for another week of the hottest Google Slides stream in Santa Cruz County. Um, if you're like me, you've had to spend a lot of time indoors this week. So I've been spending that time researching the subject I'm going to be talking about now. Um, it's extra nerdy. You might find it extra nerdy. I don't know. We'll see if this lands. Anyway, Um, this is a continuation of a previous lecture. This is another short lecture about Bardesanes. Bardesanes of Edessa, somebody who I talked about in the context of his unique astrology that condemns the planets to go to hell um, a couple of weeks ago. Now we're back to Bardesanes because there's so much to say about this guy. Uh, an interesting man, far more interesting than even me, a man with an interesting life. But what I want to get into today is his name. His name, Bardesanes of Edessa. What is that? Names mean things, especially in the ancient world. Um, well, Edessa is a place. It's a city. It's a city you can see on the slide there. That's a vertical top-down plan of the city. Edessa is a city in modern-day Turkey. It's in between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It's in Mesopotamia. And the Dyson is a smaller river that runs through the city and floods all the time and just wrecks the place in antiquity. Subsequently, its course has been changed. The Emperor Justinian had some engineers change the course of the river so it floods less badly. But in the ancient world, Dyson, the river Dyson, flooded Edessa all the time. And Bardesanes is just Bardeitsan, which in Syriac, and we'll talk about what that means in a second, in Syriac means son of the river Dyson. Probably not literally true, but it is indicative of where he comes from. Bardeitsan comes from where the Dyson River flows, which is Edessa. Bardesanes of Edessa. It's almost a little redundant to say it twice. But so Edessa is a really interesting place. It's interesting in its own right, and it's interesting because it's basically formative for Bardesanes. It allows him to become the person that he is. So what is this place, Edessa? That's what I want to talk about a little bit today. So when we talk about ancient history, especially ancient history in the Roman period, 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries CE, we think, right, mostly in terms of big empires. You got the Roman Empire on the one side, and that's the one that most of us focus a lot of our research on. That Roman Empire at this point includes Greece. It's a largely bilingual empire, or it's governed bilingually. And then we think of this empire as in confrontation with, for instance, the Persians, or the Parthians as they're known at this point in their history. An empire centered in Iran, although its capital is actually in Mesopotamia, a town called Ctesiphon, which is near modern Baghdad. So that's the other big empire, and then there are, if we expand our gaze a little bit more, there are bigger empires to the east, even sort of further on. But we do generally think about the world as being divided up between these large states at this period. What that view of things, correct as it is in the main, can obscure is the existence of kind of not just peripheral empires like Nubia or Aksum or Saba, which I hope to talk about during a future one of these lectures, but the little statelets that get squeezed in between, the little bitty statelets that get squished in between these big empires. Because in that space in between the borderlands between Rome and Parthia, in the Middle East, a whole bunch of these little states kind of emerge, and Edessa is one of them. Edessa is one with a particularly interesting history. It is independent from about 130 BCE to 240 CE with interruptions, so it actually has quite a long history of independent statehood, of playing these various rivals off one another, because it becomes independent before Rome is really even in the zone. And it does eventually get swallowed up by Rome, but it's got a long period of time before that happens. So because it's in this kind of stuck in the middle position, Edessa develops a really kind of interesting cultural identity. It's a blend of Greek stuff, because Roman culture in the East is basically Greek culture. Not to say that, indeed, Hellenization precedes the coming of the Roman Empire in the East as well. So the cultural identity of Edessa is really made up of Greek culture, of Persian culture, and of something that isn't really either of them. A kind of Assyrian, Arabian culture that Edessa shares in common with a lot of these other kind of little statelets that are around there. So the town actually goes by the name, in antiquity, Orhai, which appears to be what its own inhabitants called it, Orhai. And that's a name that survived a lot longer than Edessa did, because you can recognize it in the town's modern name. It's called Urfa, or Şanlıurfa. It's a town in as I said, now Turkey. But this town of Orhai was colonized by the Greeks, under the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids are one of the successor kingdoms who come after Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great dies without really having made disposition for what's going to happen with his empire, so his generals split it up. And the Seleucids are one of the kingdoms that result. They bring the elephants. Wherever they go, they bring the elephants with them. They are proud owners of elephants. They go on the coins, they go on the armies, all that jazz. They also may have invented time. They do invent this thing called the Seleucid era, which is the first way of numbering years that looks something like the kind of BC CE system that we now use. And that remains the standard way of doing dates in the Near East up until the Hijri dating system is introduced by Islam. So the Seleucids come in and they start colonizing, right? Basically taking land from the people who were living there already, who had been living there as Persian subjects for a long time, or possibly as independent city-states. And when the Seleucids colonize, they usually take over a town that's already there and they rename it. And they tend to rename the towns either after a Seleucid king, so that's where the name of Antioch comes from, and all the various kind of Antiochs there are in the Near East. They're named after Antiochus the Great. It's one of the early kings of the Seleucids. But if they don't name the new town after one of their own rulers, they name it after some place that they remember from, like Macedonia, where all these Greeks came from originally. And that's where Edessa comes from. Edessa is some like little hick town in Macedonia, in northern Greece, or possibly in Fyrom, I'm not even sure. But its name gets transferred to Orhai, a town that the Seleucid colonists are kind of taking over at this point. And that process of colonization and Hellenization goes really far in a lot of towns in the Middle East. So the Greek elite, even after the Seleucid Empire has kind of collapsed, the Greek elite remains at the municipal level running stuff. Greek becomes the language of commerce, of politics. So people who don't speak Greek, people who belong to the pre-Greek population, in a lot of these towns end up becoming a kind of an underclass. But that doesn't happen in Edessa. Edessa kicks out, or gets rid of in some other way, its Greek elites. Maybe they just kind of fall into obscurity. But they go away. The colonists basically disappear. And the town ends up getting ruled by a native dynasty, the Abgarids. They're called the Abgarids because most of their kings were named Abgar. Um, they continue to speak and write in Syriac, um, which you can see some examples of in some of in the rock inscription very faintly there. They continue to worship their own gods rather than assimilating that worship to worship of the Greek gods, as happened in a number of other cities in the Seleucid Empire. So they maintain this kind of very strong uh, Syriac identity in the face of colonization, and that translates into, as I said, political independence that lasts for quite a long time. Now, to maintain that political independence means playing this kind of delicate game, playing the Parthians off against the Romans and vice versa, um, which works for a long time. There are moments when Roman history kind of runs into Edessan history, and it's kind of like a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Edessa is always kind of outwitting them. Probably the most famous of these moments is when Crassus, um, in the mid first century BCE, Crassus, one of the triumvirs, along with Pompey and Julius Caesar, decides he's going to go and pick a fight with the Parthian Empire and take some territory from them. So he rolls up down there, takes an army of Romans, and he needs somebody to guide him. And King Abgar is like, "Yeah, well, we'll help you out. We know how to get to Parthia from here. It's just right across the river." So some Edessans, under the command of, I believe it was then King Abgar the Fourth, lead Crassus's army over there, and just get it totally lost. And this army ends up being massacred by the Parthians in large part because they ran out of food and water and didn't know where it was. So that is an example of the of the ways in which Edessa, the Edessans, kind of play the big kingdoms off one another. Now the Edessans do end up eventually falling into the hands of the Romans at a moment of sort of weakness in the in Persia, where the Parthians are collapsing as a dynasty and the Sassanids are taking their place. Roman power kind of pushes eastward in the Mesopotamian region, and that means absorbing Edessa. So the last king of an independent Edessa is Abgar the Eighth, and this is during the lifetime of Bardesanes. It's thought that he probably had to go into exile after the fall of the independent Edessan kingdom, or perhaps chose to go into exile, but he left town for a while, whatever the case was. And then the city of Edessa briefly returns to independence during the reign of the Emperor Pupienus. True story. That's a real name of a Roman guy. This is probably 238, 239, and Edessa remains independent for a few years after that, before eventually being retaken by Rome and converted into just a basic old colony. So Edessa is really in a position to be influenced quite heavily by the cultures and the giant polities on either side of it, but retains a kind of a spirited cultural independence during this whole period. And one of the ways in which, the most significant ways in which that works out, is that Edessa is basically where Syriac literature gets its start. There's this kind of inscriptional alphabet which is used in Edessa and also surrounding communities, and Edessa is the place where that same alphabet starts getting used to record works of literature, works of philosophy, basically write books. Basically taking on the role that the Greek or Latin would have in the publication or circulation of books further westward in the Roman Empire. And the language that shows up in the first books that are published, Bardesanes, by the way, is probably the earliest author to have written and composed books in Syriac. He sort of invents Syriac prose style. The language that he uses is at bottom Syriac. Syriac is a Semitic language. It's most closely related to Aramaic and Hebrew, and then slightly more distantly related to Arabic. Um, so it's clearly that language that he's writing, but there are a lot of loan words from Greek and Persian, and loan concepts from both those kind of world literatures. Um, Bardesanes, as I think I mentioned last time, is a bit of a Gnostic. He believes in uh, a dualist cosmology, basically, in which there's a good god and an evil god. Um, that's conceptually, in his case, quite possibly a borrowing from the Zoroastrian cosmology of Persia, where there are indeed these two gods fighting it out. Um, the title of the one book written in his tradition that features him as a character, probably not written by him, but by a disciple, which is the book that I talked about last time I was talking about Bardesanes. It's called the Book of the Laws of the Countries, and in Syriac that's Ketava de Namusa Dathruta. Namusa is the word for law, and you might recognize that word is just nomos, borrowed from Greek. So those are the ways in which this very early Syriac literature shows itself to be producing a kind of a synthesis of all the cultural and political units that Edessa is surrounded by and under pressure from. So the habit of using the script to write literature, um, once it gets out of Edessa, spreads like wildfire. All of the other towns where Syriac is a major language start using Syriac as a script for writing literary compositions as well. And not only towns that have Syriac as their language. This alphabet, the Syriac alphabet, is one of the most probably important alphabets um, historically in terms of the number of languages it leads to literacy. So this alphabet is the basis of the Arabic alphabet, for instance. This alphabet is the basis for the writing system that was used to record Middle Persian, the writing system that was used to write down Sogdian, eventually, even 1,000 years later, the writing system that was used to write down Mongolian. Descends in a fairly easily traceable line from this alphabet. The writing system that is developed in a kind of a cursive form in Edessa, turned into a book script there. So as I said, Bardesanes is really the guy who does this, who develops the script as a tool for writing literature, for producing literary compositions. It's hard to imagine a script like this really coming out of anywhere else. Edessa is kind of uniquely positioned to assert itself culturally in this way. And Bardesanes, as I said, is kind of a product of that milieu. So I want to wrap up here with a kind of a story about Bardesanes. And it belongs to a genre of stories that I like to call shooting at kids with bows and arrows. Some of you may be thinking, how long did it take him to find the worst picture of William Tell that was available on the internet? The answer is not long. Actually, this is one of the first results, but it did take me a long time to verify that it was the worst, which it is. So this genre of stories, just involves like shooting an arrow at a kid for some reason. In the case of William Tell, the most well-known story like this, William Tell, the Swiss patriot, has to shoot an arrow off of his son's head because the Germans are telling him to. I don't really know. There's a story like this about Cambyses where he hits the kid deliberately because Cambyses, who is a king of Achaemenid Persia, was kind of a notorious jerko. But there's also this story about Bardesanes, which is a story that's told by somebody who met Bardesanes in Edessa. It's told as fact. And in this story, Bardesanes says, "Hey, you want to see a cool trick?" And the guy, this is Julius Africanus, kind of an encyclopedic writer of encyclopedias from the 3rd century CE, says, "Yeah, I'd like to see a trick." So Bardesanes asks some strapping young lad to go stand like 50 feet away and hold a shield out next to him, a wooden shield. And Bardesanes then shoots a bunch of arrows at the shield, and they end up not only not hitting the kid, but producing a portrait of the kid. Bardesanes paints the kid's portrait with arrows. Well, what does this have to do with anything? The skill which Parthians were thought to pride themselves on the most, which indeed was part of Persian child rearing techniques in earlier periods where we've got some evidence about it, is being really good archers. So when Bardesanes is shooting arrows at this kid making a portrait, he's saying, "Hey, I can do anything the Persians can do, and I can do it better." When he writes kind of a dialectical argument, a dialogue, of the sort that he writes in the Book of the Laws of the Countries, he's saying, "Hey, I can do anything the Greeks can do, and I can do it better." And when he writes that dialogue in Syriac, he's saying, "Hey, I'm an Edessan. That's where I'm from. I'm a son of the river Daitsan." So we are, I think, next time I return to Bardesanes, going to talk a little bit more about what is actually in that book, because it's fun, it's gruesome. There's a lot of cannibalism, a lot of incest. But that is going to be, like I said, a thing for next time. Uh, the take-home point for today, I guess, is that people don't just hatch out of an egg. They don't just come from nowhere. They come from places. Bardesanes comes from Edessa, and when we understand the place where he comes from, we understand the man, we understand the work of the man in a new light. Well, that's all for this evening. Everybody stay safe, stay socially distanced, and I will catch you next week.